What if everything you thought you knew about the sister-wise family was only half the story, and behind the scenes, a quiet financial shift changed everything? Stay with me, because what I am about to reveal will completely flip your perspective. And if you want more shocking breakdowns like this, hit subscribe right now, because you do not want to miss what comes next. Back in the day, this family operated like a unit that could not be broken, a system built on trust, loyalty, and a shared understanding that no matter what happened, everyone would come together to support whoever needed it most. When one person struggled, the rest would step in without hesitation. When one person needed financial help, the entire structure would adjust to make sure that person stayed afloat. It was a cycle that created stability, and it gave every member a sense of security because they believed they were part of something bigger than themselves, something that would always have their back. But over time, something began to change, slowly at first, almost unnoticeable, like a quiet shift in the foundation beneath a house. Everything still looked the same on the surface, the smiles, the conversations, the idea of unity. But underneath, there was tension building, something that would eventually grow into something impossible to ignore. Because when financial independence starts entering a system that relies on shared control, everything begins to shift. And in a plural family dynamic, that shift can be even more powerful because the balance is fragile to begin with. And once one person realizes they no longer need the system to survive, it changes the entire equation, because now the power dynamic is no longer equal. Now there are choices. Now there is freedom, and that freedom can be threatening to those who rely on maintaining control. And that is where the story begins to take a darker turn, because what happens when the structure that once protected everyone starts benefiting only a few? What happens when the very system designed to support the family becomes the thing that divides it? And this is where viewers began to notice a pattern, not all at once, but in pieces, moments that did not quite add up, decisions that seemed to favor certain outcomes over others. And as those moments started to connect, a bigger picture began to form, one that raised serious questions about fairness, about transparency, and about who was truly benefiting from the choices being made. Because at the center of it all was money, assets, and control. And when those elements are concentrated in the hands of one person or a small group, it creates an imbalance that is hard to ignore, especially when everyone involved has contributed in some way to building that wealth. And this is why the move from Las Vegas becomes such a critical moment in this story, because it was not just a change of location, it was a complete reset of the financial structure that had been built over years. In Las Vegas, each wife had her own home, her own space, and most importantly, her own asset, something tangible, something that represented years of investment and stability. And that setup worked because it allowed for both independence and unity at the same time. But when the decision was made to leave that behind, everything changed, because now those individual assets had to be sold, converted into liquid funds. And once that happened, the clear lines of ownership began to disappear, and the money that once belonged to individuals became part of a larger pool. And once it entered that shared space, control over it became less transparent and more centralized. And this is where the tension begins to rise. Because while the idea of a family pot sounds fair in theory, in practice, it depends entirely on how that pot is managed and who is making the decisions about where that money goes. And when viewers started to look closer, it appeared that not everyone was benefiting equally from that system. Because while some members were maintaining financial stability, others were facing uncertainty, moving between temporary living situations, and struggling to establish something permanent. And that contrast is what fuels the suspense, because it creates a sense that something is not quite right, something that cannot be easily explained away as coincidence. Because when multiple decisions lead to the same outcome, it starts to look less like chance and more like a pattern. And as that pattern becomes clearer, the emotional impact of the situation grows stronger, because this is not just about money, it is about trust. It is about the belief that everyone was working toward the same goal. And when that belief starts to break down, it affects everything: relationships, communication, and the very idea of what the family represents. And this is where the story becomes deeply compelling, because it forces viewers to question not just what happened, but why it happened, and whether it could have been different, because every decision along the way carried consequences, some immediate and some that would only become clear years later. And as we continue to follow this story, the sense of suspense only grows stronger, because there is always another layer, another detail, another piece of the puzzle that brings us closer to understanding the full picture, but at the same time raises even more questions about what was really going on behind the scenes, and whether the outcome we're seeing now was always the direction things were heading, or if there was a moment where everything could have changed if a different choice had been made. As the situation continued to unfold, the consequences of those earlier decisions began to surface in ways that could no longer be ignored, because what once seemed like temporary adjustments started turning into long-term realities, and the difference between stability and uncertainty became more visible with each passing moment. Because while some individuals appeared to be settling into comfortable living situations, others were still trying to find their footing, moving from place to place, holding on to the hope that the original vision of building something together would eventually come back into focus. But that hope slowly began to fade as more time passed, and the outcomes remained uneven. And this is where the emotional tension intensifies, because it is no longer just about financial arrangements. It is about the realization that the system they trusted may not have been working in the way they believed. And that realization can be incredibly difficult to accept, especially when years of effort, sacrifice, and belief have been invested into that system. And as viewers continued to watch these events play out, it became increasingly clear that the move to Flagstaff had set off a chain reaction that was still unfolding, because the sale of the Las Vegas homes had created a pool of money that represented not just financial value, but personal history. And once that money was combined, the question of how it would be used became central to everything that followed. And this is where perceptions began to form, because when one major purchase stood out as significantly different from the circumstances of others, it created a contrast that was impossible to ignore. And even if there were explanations behind those decisions, the visual difference alone was enough to raise questions. And those questions only grew as time went on, because the gap between what was expected and what actually happened continued to widen. And at the same time, discussions about the management of shared income began to surface, adding another layer of complexity to the situation. Because when income from a major source, like a television show, is funneled through a central structure, the way it is distributed can have a significant impact on everyone involved. And if that distribution is not clearly understood or agreed upon, it can lead to confusion, frustration, and a sense of imbalance. And this is where the idea of control becomes even more important, because control over financial resources often translates into control over decisions. And when that control is concentrated, it can create a dynamic where not everyone feels equally empowered. And that feeling can influence relationships in profound ways, because it affects trust, communication, and the willingness to continue operating within the same system. And as some members began to pursue independence and make decisions that reflected their own needs and priorities, the structure that once held everything together started to shift even further, because independence changes the dynamic. It introduces new possibilities, but also new challenges, especially when the original system was built on interdependence and shared responsibility. And as these changes took place, the long-term impact of earlier financial decisions became more apparent, because the ability to move forward confidently often depends on having access to resources. And when those resources are tied up or have been allocated in ways that are not evenly distributed, it can limit options and create additional stress.
And this is where the story takes on an even deeper level of suspense, because the outcomes are still evolving and the full picture is not yet complete. Because while some questions,
In the end, this is not just a story about the sister wives family. It is about choices, consequences, and truths that refuse to stay hidden. And if you made it this far, make sure you subscribe right now, because the next breakdown will be even more shocking and you do not want to miss it.